Today, we welcome Sara Yerkes. Sara is serving the International Code Council, ICC, as Senior Vice President of Global Relations. Her duties include overseeing public policy and government relations functions of the organization, developing and implementing a proactive program of effective lobbying and persuasive advocacy, representing and speaking for ICC on policy matters and program activities, and coordinating the strategies to implement policies at the federal, state, and local levels. Sara oversees the state and local activities that have successfully gained the adoption and use of the international codes in all 50 states, U.S. territories, and by federal agencies, as well as overseeing programs like plumbing, mechanical, and fuel gas programs, resources for codes adoptions, and fire service activities. What are codes and standards? How are codes different from standards, and what are the elements that make the governmental consensus process different from the standards development process? We're delighted to have Sara here today to discuss with us this important topic. So for those listening along, we look forward to your questions and engagement during the presentation. I'll be tracking the chat during the presentation, and so please post your questions there or send me a private chat as we go along. At this point, I thank you, Sara, and I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Karen, and thank you for inviting me to participate in this webinar and present to you about codes and standards. It's been my life for almost 40 years. And when I started in this area, I used to think, how can we make codes and standards more sexy? It's not exactly a sexy subject, but I learned throughout the years that it can be very dynamic and passionate. So I've truly enjoyed my work in this area. I think first I'll start with a little bit of an overview about the International Code Council. Karen, if you could go to the next slide, please. We are a not-for-profit association, a 501c6. We develop model codes and standards, and we do this by promoting and advocating and providing services to support the codes, and that's how we subsidize the development and maintenance of the model codes. It's not an inexpensive enterprise. It's costly to keep these codes maintained up to date. We publish a revised edition, updated edition every 3 years. So it's a continuous process. And as I said, we provide a robust infrastructure to support the jurisdictions that use our codes. And we'll get into more details as we go along. And I encourage you all to ask questions on the chat. Don't hesitate to interrupt me, Karen, if questions come up that you think I should answer at the moment. So the next slide, please. The codes that ICC develops are model codes. They are meant to be revised and adapted by the jurisdictions that adopt them. And we respect that. We respect the authority of the jurisdictions to amend the codes to fit their special climatic, geographic, or whatever other local needs they may have. What we don't like is when we see jurisdictions amending the model codes down, because the model codes form the basis. They're already the basic requirements. And sometimes we call them minimum requirements. I don't like the word minimum, so I prefer to use the base requirements. Going beyond code is always good, and we support that. Now, the process in the United States is very diverse. There's not a one size fits all. There are states that adopt statewide through legislation, other states through rulemaking. We have home rule states that let the jurisdictions decide if they want to adopt and enforce at the local level. And then we have states that have statewide adoptions for, sorry if you hear noise, it's out on my street, states that adopt for state-owned or leased buildings. And then they leave it up to the local jurisdictions to adopt or not. So what we offer with the I-codes is a common format. And this is the reason why ICC was formed back in 1994 when the 3 regional organizations decided to create ICC. And then in 2003, we finally consolidated the 3 organizations into what is now the International Code Council, to provide one set of model codes for the entire country so that an engineer or an architect from California could practice in New York or North Carolina or Ohio, because the codes based on the I codes follow the same common format. Chapter 11 in every single code, whether it's a customized code or a code just based on the model code, Chapter 11 is accessibility. So the architects and engineers know exactly where to go anywhere in the country for that information. Next slide, please. So the model codes form the basis of regulations, safety and construction regulations in all the states. All 50 states, District of Columbia, US territories, and several agencies like State Department uses our model codes for constructing embassies all over the world. The Department of Defense references our model codes, like the building code, the plumbing code, and the unified facilities criteria, which is like the construction code for the Department of Defense. Now, there's some provisions in the DoD, for example, buildings that have restricted entrance or buildings that you don't want, like FBI or the CIA headquarters. You don't want the whole world knowing how they're built. So there's some provisions that are not made public, and even the code officials don't go into those areas. So jurisdictions also opt to customize the codes, and we have several states that do that. California, New York, Virginia, Chicago, Ohio, Florida are some examples where we customize their codes. They're based on the model codes, but they're the California building codes, the Virginia codes, and so on. So they have that ownership. They like that. Jurisdictions like to own their building regulations. So the next slide, please. So to make some sense out of the codes and standards world of ICC, I need to explain to you the process a little bit and what defines a national voluntary consensus standard. Now, under federal law, there's no difference between a standard and the code. So we kind of fall under the same designation in the federal regulations for the principles that we have to abide. Okay, we have to abide by certain principles in order to be considered national voluntary consensus standards. So the governmental consensus process is very unique in that it's very much like rulemaking. Everybody can participate, anyone can submit a code change, you can come and vote at the code action hearings, which just finished in this month. We just held them. But the final vote, which is usually at the public hearings held in the fall, at those hearings, only the public officials that represent their jurisdictions are permitted to vote. And the reason for that is to avoid special interests, undue influence in the process. So we like that the final vote is just by those people that have no financial vested interest other than public safety. So we conform to what we call the United States Standard Strategy, which is a document that's produced by the SDOs under the umbrella of the American National Standards Institute that provides guidance to the codes and standards developers on what it means to produce a consensus standard. We also follow the requirements in the public law, the National Technology and Transfer Advancement Act of 1995, which is the Public Law 104-113, that codified the executive order OMB A119. This outlines the principles that we have to follow, and it also directs the federal agencies to use non-government codes and standards for their specific agencies' use. The ICC standards are developed through a different process. It's an ANSI process, and we follow what is called the essential requirements that ANSI puts out for due process, and that guides how the committee should look like, what a consensus looks like, the number of representatives on the committee, so it shows a balanced committee. The next slide, please. The United States standard system is complicated, and I've tried to explain it to folks from other countries who come and they want to understand how the United States produces its codes and standards. And it's a very foreign concept to other countries where normally the government dictates how the private sector should run. So it's the government that produces the codes and standards for the majority of other countries. Here in the United States, however, it's a private-public partnership. The private sector, organizations like ICC, NFPA, ASTM, UL, ASHRAE, ASME, and others develop these codes and standards, which then the jurisdictions adopt and enforce. So developed in the private sector, but adopted and enforced by the public sector. The next slide, please. As I said, the governmental consensus process has to comply with these laws. I already addressed the national standard strategy. It facilitates also how American businesses can compete internationally, globally. And I think you all understand the importance of a standard in the United States. When you plug in your hairdryer at the Hilton or at the Marriott, or at any hotel, it works. Thank God, because we have standards that require how the electrical wiring is and all those safety things. So standards make the world run, really. They're very important to our day-to-day life. We just don't think much about them, but they're there, and you use them all the time. You depend on things that are developed using a standards process. The OMB circular, I already explained that. That was an executive order which was codified in 1995 with this public law. This is sort of the Bible of the governmental consensus process. These two documents primarily, the OMB circular and the public law. The next slide. Okay, the US standard strategy is complicated for various reasons, not just because the standards are developed in the private sector, but because it's a sector-based system. What that means is that we recognize that there are different needs. Each sector, each industry has its own specific needs. You cannot take 3 years to develop a standard for the Apple phone, the iPhones, right? It would be ridiculous, just no way. That technology changes so fast. They use different methods of developing their standards. There's a Canvas method, and there are many other methods. But for the purpose of construction and safety standards, we follow the OMBA 119, and the process that ICC uses is a 3-year process. It's a continuous, it's a vicious cycle. It never stops. So we just put out the 2021 codes in the fall of 2020. Immediately in January, calls went out for applications, nominations to serve on committees. We've already had hearings in the spring. We'll have hearings in the fall, and the 2024 codes will be coming out probably end of 2023. So it's a continuous process. And some people think it moves too fast, other people think it moves too slow. But the fact here is that the United States is very flexible. Our process or the strategy in the United States is very flexible in order to meet the demands of an industry or a specific sector, business sector. And why are these standards so important to the US economy? Well, they look after health and safety issues, so they protect the consumer by demanding that these products comply with these standards. They promote public good. They enhance the competitiveness of the US industry, and this is very important. And then we all benefit from this system, and we can all play a role because these processes, whether the model code development process or the standards process, are open to everybody's participation. Next slide, please. I already talked about the federal law that requires federal agencies to use the private sector national consensus standards. And that's important that if we remember, it's got to be national consensus standards that the agencies use. And this started back some years ago, probably in the 80s and 90s, when the Department of Defense had so many standards, was so bogged down. The government was so bogged down with keeping up with the private industry, the private sector. I remember when I worked for an FPA, and I left an FPA in 2000, 2001 to come to ICC, I was finding references to NFPA standards published in 1934. So not just 3 years behind, but decades behind. But the federal government was having a tough time keeping up with the updates to the standards and codes. And DoD really was sort of the agency that really pushed this public law and the OMBA 119 to encourage the agencies to move from military specs and government standards to the private sector standards. And we all benefited from that because now obviously the federal government is using our model codes. As I mentioned, State Department, DoD, US Capitol, they all base their building requirements on the I codes. The next slide, please. Okay, this just gives you a little bit of history on the OMB A119. It was originally signed in 1982 and then it's been revised several times. I've been involved. It tells you what kind of a dinosaur I am. I've been involved in a lot of these creations and revisions. It's kind of scary to think about it. And I don't know where time has gone, but it's the truth. And anyway, we update these documents. We get groups together, usually under the umbrella of the American National Standards Institute and NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology. They play sort of public-private partnership role, where NIST represents the federal agencies and ANSI represents the private sector standards developers. And we come together, private sector and public sector, and update these documents. It goes through Federal Register and for public comment and the way rulemaking usually goes through. Next slide, please. Okay, so the definition of a standard in the code, and I already said that there's no differentiation in the federal laws between a code and the standard. We all fall under the same definition. Now, if you were to have asked me this back in the 80s, I'd have said there's a big difference between a code and the standard. Because back then, there was still, it was still thought that the code would use mandatory language, legal language. So we would use words like shall. There was no gray area. You know, the code would tell you exactly what you had to do and how you had to do it. But now the standards have also become more legal documents. And they've started using the same terminologies, the same legal language. So the difference is sort of been erased. Now, the difference between a model code and the standard is still big. A model code provides a regulatory framework that the jurisdictions will use. And in that regulatory framework, the standards are referenced. So the model code drives also the use of the standards. The model code will say where to construct, how to construct. The standard will say how you install, how you maintain, you know, the installation and maintenance standards that the code references. And the model codes reference hundreds of standards from an FPA, from UL, and many others. So again, regulatory framework, referencing standards to complete the whole picture, and you can put up a building from the ground up until the occupants move in through these codes and standards. A voluntary consensus standard, this is very important. When you hear people talk about standards, they need to be national voluntary consensus standards in order, according to the federal law, in order to be used by the federal agencies. And this is important because we believe in this standard system that consensus is very important. You have to allow all stakeholders to participate, to have a consensus-based standard. This is, again, the difference between the United States and other countries, where here in the United States, we build these standards from the ground up, right? The stakeholders, the volunteers come together, they develop these standards, and then the government decides to adopt and enforce them. Next slide, please. Some of the principles that are defined in these laws that I'm talking about are the following. This is, again, the Bible of the model code development process. The process has to be open to all. There has to be a balance of interest. There has to be a due process, and there has to be an appeals process. If the code comes out and you're not happy, you can appeal. We just had appeals on the Energy Conservation Code. Some of you may have followed that whole process. So if somebody is not happy with the outcome, they can appeal. Next slide, please. This is a repetitious slide. This law was signed, it says March 7, but no annual date. It was 1995. The law came out in 1995. It was actually signed in 1996. And I already explained about the Department of Defense role in moving the federal agencies into the National Voluntary Consensus Standards. Next slide, please. Again, why is this a benefit to the federal government? Because the private sector standards developers like ICC subsidize the development of the model codes and the standards that we produce. We don't use any taxpayers' money. So by the federal government using our standards and codes, they're decreasing the cost of their own goods and services. It minimizes the burden of compliance with federal law and private sector initiatives and so on. It just serves the federal agencies well, not just the private sector. And it promotes, again, this is very important. When you're in the codes and standards arena, you hear a lot about the importance of the American businesses competition outside the United States. And we participate through ANSI and the ISO process. ICC is a secretary to one of the standards. So we're trying to also have more uniformity throughout the world, not just here in the United States, but working with our partners in Europe and Middle East and South America. Next slide. I think I've said a lot of this, so we can move on. The representation of the federal government in our process is very important. We rely on the science that the federal agencies and other private sector organizations bring to us in academia. So we depend on NIST, on FEMA, HUD, DOD, and other agencies that bring their knowledge and science to us through the code hearings, through the code development process into the code hearings. Next, please. I already, this is again, just going over all the use of our codes by the government. All these agencies are using model codes, referencing them. We usually say the codes are adopted in the states, but they're used by the federal agencies because the adoption process of the federal agencies is a bit different. They will cite our codes or reference them, and rulemaking, it's a little bit different than the way the states and local jurisdictions adopt. Next slide. Okay, now the standards development. We follow the governmental consensus process for the model codes, but we follow an ANSI process known as the ANSI's essential requirements. ANSI is a private sector organization. They were founded in 1918, and they serve as an umbrella for the American standards developer. It is the US official representative in ISO and the Electrotechnical Commission in Europe. The countries in Europe, they vote, each country has one vote. So we sometimes are very much at the disadvantage if we are alone in the vote when Europe, for example, can vote en bloc and they'll vote together. So it leaves the US at a disadvantage, but it is what it is. We have one vote. Next slide, please. So many organizations like ASTM, ASTM is probably one of the largest, if not the largest standards developer in the United States. They develop everything from standards for cement to bike helmets, you name it. And you'll see the designation, many products that you buy. They develop over 11,000 standards. Now, not all of ASTM standards are considered American national standards. And the reason for that is that you have to pay in order to designate a standard, an American national standard. And sometimes the committees will decide they'll follow the ANSI process. They'll develop the standard following the essential requirements, but they don't seek the ANS designation. They're still national voluntary consensus standards. They're just not designated ANS. So we follow the essential requirements, and all the standards that we've developed so far are American national standards. Now, the IECC, which is moving from the governmental consensus process to the ANSI standards process, that has not been decided yet if it will be an ANS, have an ANS designation, but it will follow the essential requirements. The next slide, please. The ANSI essential requirements mirror the OMB A119 and the Public Law 114, 104-113, sorry. And those principles are, again, openness, lack of dominance, means it has to be a balance, coordination, harmonization. We got notified that the standards being developed, you file a notice called the PINs that you're intending to develop the standard, and then you have to consider all the views and objections, and there has to be a consensus vote in order for the standard to be issued. And again, there's an appeals process. You can also file an appeal on a standard. You file the appeal with ANSI. Next slide. Okay, ICC also has criteria for our standards development process, and that's our Council Policy 12 and Council Policy 7 that outlines consensus procedures and having 9 interest categories represented to show diversity and consensus in the committees. Next, please. How you can participate. We put out a call for nominations to serve on the standards development committees. The board of directors of ICC appoints the committee. We're just going through that for the International Energy Conservation Code. We received over 340 applications, and now we're going through that process. The slate will be presented to the board, and the board then will make the final decision. For the standards process, we produce the initial draft, gets posted. Everything is very transparent and posted online. So everything will be conducted through CDP Access, which is a cloud-based process that allows participation from the comfort of your offices. You can sit at your computer and propose code changes. You can have a discussion with your colleagues and partners and get support for your proposed changes and so on. So after the draft is posted, the committee reviews the proposals. It either approves, disapproves, or sends back for additional work. If additional work is needed by work groups, these work groups are formed, and the process allows for a lot of discussion, much more than the governmental consensus process, which allows you 3 minutes to testify at a public hearing. With the standards process, it's a committee-driven process, so there's a lot more opportunity for discussion and debate, which is why we think it'll be appropriate for the Energy Conservation Code, because that's a code that involves a lot of changing technologies and methodologies, and more discussion is needed than what's allowed through a public, a governmental consensus process. The meetings are open. The next slide, please. Okay, so continue on how you can participate. So there's a public comment draft. The committee publishes this draft and receives comment, public comment. The committee then reviews and addresses the public comment. And the repeated public comment period on the revised, they repeat the process if they feel that it's needed for the revised draft. So they will continue to have public debate if necessary. There's a committee ballot once all the comments are resolved, and the committee votes on the approval of the document. And then the standard is published. Either it's a new standard, brand new, or it's an updated standard. The process is the same for creating a new standard as it is updating the standard. We go through the same public comment period, public review, committee review, and so on. So it's very similar for the update as it is for the creation of a new standard. The new slide. Okay, we have several standards now that are under development. Offsite construction, big deal right now. We're working on these two standards, 1200 and 1205. We expect them to be completed this summer. There's some standards that are being updated. The ICC IBHS 600 wind, high wind is completed. The wildfire 605 is in development, and we'll be developing other standards to address other natural hazards. We have been talking with IBHS and have agreed that there's a need to develop standards for other natural disasters. So we did the high wind, we're doing the wildfire, and there's going to be a seismic one that's in process. And I don't know what's going to be next, but that will be decided by IBHS and ICC. The next slide, please. I mentioned the hearings just finished. Those were the committee action hearings. They were virtual. We had over 1,200 participants in this last cycle. That was an increase from 2019. So, you know, we were so concerned about COVID and having virtual hearings, but apparently it worked out very well and great participation. The codes, the model codes are split into two groups. Group A and Group B, and Group A included building, fire, fuel gas, mechanical plumbing, private sewage, property maintenance, residential swimming, wildland urban interface, and the zoning codes. Next slide. So Karen also wanted me to share what's the next opportunity to participate. So we have our annual conference coming up, September 19th through the 21st, going to be in Pittsburgh. And then the public comment hearings, which are will be the final vote for the Group A that I just mentioned, will be September 21 through 28th in Pittsburgh at the Lawrence Convention Center. The address is there on the slide. I hope some of you can participate. We're going to have some virtual events and then some in-person events. It's going to be a hybrid. Much shorter, not as much going on. We will not have a lot of the sessions that we traditionally have. We're not going to have an expo, for example, but we'll have the business meeting and then the public hearings. The next slide, please. And I guess that's it. And I know this is a lot of information, and it can be a bit confusing and repetitious, but I think the United States standard system is the best in the world. We have a good process to develop these standards and codes. And then the most beneficial and important, in my opinion, is that in the United States, we believe in our rules and laws and we enforce them. So we have the system in place at the state or local level to enforce the codes and standards, which is challenging sometimes in other countries that we work with that don't have that system in place. And the codes are only as good as they're implemented. You know, if they are just books sitting on a shelf, they're not going to make much difference. So my work here at ICC has been to work with the jurisdictions. I started with the 2000 edition of the codes, and we saw them widely accepted throughout the country. And you know, I have a lot of respect for the public officials that give their their time, devote their careers to public safety. They're sort of unsung heroes, and we don't notice them because the buildings are safe. The only time they're noticed is if there's a catastrophe or a building collapses or a crane falls against the building or something, and then there's a story in the newspaper. But our code officials are committed individuals, very dedicated, and I have a lot of respect for them. So with that, Karen, I don't know if there are questions. I saw quite a bit of chat going on. So tell me what folks want to know. Karen, I think you're muted.
Why, thank you, Sarah. Hopefully you can hear me now.
I can hear you now. Hopefully you all heard me, because gosh, I hope I don't have to repeat this whole thing.
Absolutely not. We heard you. And we have a good question for you. When deciding whether a code update is an update or if it's a new code, what is considered when making that decision?
Okay, that's very, I love that question. It's a new code when it's starting from scratch. So the most recent codes we have were the International Green Construction Code and the Swimming and Spa Code. Those were created new. I purposely started changing the terms. We used to say, oh, the new codes are out. So every 3 years, the model codes are updated. So they don't start from scratch. They just go back to the table and people will submit changes to those existing codes. So the 09 gets updated, becomes 2012, 2015, 2018, 2021, and so on. So those are updates. They're being updated. And the updates are not always new things that are put in the code. They could also be old technologies or ways of constructing that are taken out and replaced maybe with more efficient, cost-effective, and safety-related provisions. So I call a new code if it's a brand new code that has never existed before. It's an update if it's an existing model code that's just up for revision. Does that explain? Does that answer the question?
I think so, but we'll wait. Yes, she says yes. And maybe a follow-up, we have a question from an attendee who is interested in what your thoughts are on what happened with the 2021 Energy Code vote and the subsequent appeals, with a caveat that they served on that Board of Appeals.
Well, you know, as staff, I sometimes have to hold my own opinions to myself. But I can tell you that in my role as the head of the Government Relations Department, I've had to explain to Congress when our process was criticized by energy advocates or by the home building industry. And they both have gone to the Hill. The Energy Conservation Code, can I say, has been a lightning rod, so to speak. It creates a lot of passion. So it became very apparent based on what was going on with the code, past history with the complaints from both sides, because both sides had complained before. It became very necessary for the board to really make a leadership decision. And I think it was a very bold and courageous decision that ICC took in deciding and saying, look, maybe the governmental consensus process is not the right process to develop this code, this model code. We will protect the code in every way possible. It will continue to be a model code. It will continue to be part of the family of I codes. It will be synchronized, aligned with the other I codes. It will be published in the same format as the other I codes. It will be published in the same frame, a time frame as the other codes. But we're going to give the interested stakeholders more time and opportunity to debate the changes to the Energy Conservation Code. It's a hot topic these days, the environment, the climate impact, energy efficiency, water efficiency. all these issues are critical to the well-being of people and the health of our planet. And so it has a lot of interest, and particularly with this administration, who's very much committed to the environmental issues. So we took a lot of criticism from folks that were not happy that we were changing from the governmental consensus process to the standards process. But what I ask is, give us an opportunity to prove that the process is going to work, and what's going to come out in 2024 is going to be a great energy conservation code. The determination from DOE just came out. There's an increase in energy efficiency in the code. It has continued to improve to increase energy efficiencies. You know, regardless of the complaints and criticism that we received, the code has progressed. And I think the proof is in the pudding. We are now going through we just finished receiving the applications for the committees for residential and commercial, and the board of directors then will be selecting those committees. But we're taking putting a lot of attention and care. The governmental members are critical to this association. They are very important members of our organization, and they will have a major role in those committees and continue to participate in the process. So I hope folks will give ICC the opportunity to show that it will continue to put out a good code, and it will continue to be part of the family of iCodes.
Excellent. Well said. And certainly, since you mentioned the membership and the important role they play, we have a question as to whether ICC is open to international participation. And if you do have international participants, are you aware of any countries or governments adopting the ICC codes?
Yes, we have several countries that participate in our process and use our code. We actually we have a representative in the Middle East. We have a Vice President of Global Activities, Judy Zakreski. We have a global membership council. They can participate as well, because now with CDP access, you don't even have to be here in the United States. The styles of construction may be different. Mexico, Colombia uses our codes. United Emirates, Dubai, Saudi Arabia. The Europeans don't use our codes because they have the Euro code and they're very European centric. But the Middle Eastern countries love the American standards, and they come to us a lot to learn about our process, how we develop the codes, and they adapt them to their own needs. So we have been influential in a lot of other countries that are using our codes. We have presences in India. We've been working in China. It doesn't necessarily always have to be about the codes, but it could be evaluation products or accreditation services. So ICC does have an international presence, which makes me very happy, Karen, because I used to be asked in the beginning, why international code council? You know, how international are you? Well, we're becoming more and more global and international, and I'll be happy to provide a list of all the adoptions of our codes across the world.
Excellent. Well, certainly we get those questions as well. And I think being available for international participation qualifies, but really great to hear that you have that level of involvement. And I was curious, earlier in your presentation, you mentioned that the jurisdictions, the iCode essentially is a framework for their use, and that they might use it in different ways. And maybe you could expand on that, what they might change or apply differently when they're making use of that code.
Sure. So the model codes, as I said, are meant to be adapted, because we figured out that there can't be a one size fits all. Now, think about the climates, let's say, in California. California is a state that has earthquakes. So seismic is very important, and Title 24 is the California code. So California will take the model code, but they will increase they'll have more stringent requirements for seismic. for protection against seismic events. Florida doesn't have the seismic concerns, but they have hurricanes, so they will adapt the codes. The wind maps for Florida are much more higher than California or other states inside the U.S. So that's the beauty of the model codes, is the ability for the jurisdiction to amend the codes, adapt them so that they are well protected. New York City, for example, and Chicago. Chicago is going through they're modernizing their Chicago code. The last major jurisdiction in the United States to move to the model codes. And they're modernizing their building codes. They finished the building code last year. They're working on the existing building code. Now they're working on other codes. But Chicago and New York are different cities than, say, Phoenix. Phoenix is sprawled out. They have plenty of land and space, and they can sprawl out. Now, New York and Chicago don't have that luxury of having that space, so they build vertically. They build high rises, and they have dense populations. So their building regulations are going to reflect those needs, high-rise construction, density of population, versus Phoenix that can build forever into the desert and never run out of space. So those are the differences that I see, and we're comfortable. And then there are some jurisdictions that want to go beyond code and go to fortified or other more stringent requirements, and that's fine too. As I said, we provide the base, which the base codes are what our members have already said. Listen, if you're going to construct, these are the minimum requirements that you have to follow in order to put up safe, resilient buildings. Going beyond, perfect, go for it. Don't go below.
Right. And you mentioned that the codes, they reference hundreds of standards. So the code sets the framework, and then the standards add a bit more,
Right.
let's say, specificity.
Right.
How do you trade out standards? Like when they get updated or revised and there's a new version, what process do you go through to trade out the standards that are listed?
Yeah, that was a very complicated discussion because, for example, the NFPA updates to their standards is on different cycles. They don't update we update everything. The model codes are all in the same cycle. So commercial building, residential building, plumbing, mechanical, all those codes are on the same cycle. So every 3 years, they're updated. NFPA has codes on different cycles. So some may be coming out this year, some next year. So that became a bit of a concern. We had to work out these arrangements with ASTM and NFPA. And usually the codes will reference the most recent existing codes. So right now, the 2021 I code probably references, I don't recall, maybe the 2019 electrical code. I'm not sure what the latest version was, but they will reference the most recently published edition of the I codes. So the standards organizations rush to also provide ICC their recent standards for reference in the codes. And again, the codes form that framework, but then you have a standard that will tell you how to install the fire sprinkler system, and those are the types of things that I call the standards I call installation and maintenance standards. So the building is up, but the standards are going to help the building function and be properly maintained.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I mean, that's so interesting. So, as a confirmation, it sounds like you're probably in pretty close contact with those standards organizations that are referenced within the codes.
Yes, and actually, Karen, something that's happening here is the digital transformation. ICC is busy now transforming a lot of its services to online services to digital formats. And we have premium, the iCodes Premium, and we have formed partnerships with over 20 standards organizations that are also providing the standards in digital format. So that's just going to facilitate putting these codes and standards at the fingertips of the people that need them, the regulators and the code users like the architects and engineers. And it's really, I think it's going to be so beneficial to those professions because they can cut and paste and edit and play around with the digital format. They can do it so much easier than with a paper, like with the code book. Although I'm told, and particularly the lawyers still like the code books, but it seems that a lot is going digital.
That is so exciting, and I'm glad that you mentioned the digitalization and transformation happening now because with my final question, I wanted to ask you, what trends are you seeing? What is that future of code development? You mentioned a couple of codes that you're working on now, but are you seeing specific areas with a lot of growth? Is there certain changes that are kind of bringing on a lot of
Yeah.
movement in the codes area?
Well, Karen, we've seen so many interesting things happen lately. Tall wood buildings, you can put up a 14-story building constructed of wood. We're seeing a lot of these technology. We're hearing conversations about using containers, like the ship containers for construction, for home building. Not just here in the United States, I heard it in Europe as well. There's always something changing. I think our community is much more tuned and aware of the environment. Where before we used to say, how's the weather going to impact this building? How do we build it so that it can sustain the climate and all? Now we're saying, how is this building going to impact the environment and the climate? So I think we're much more attuned to these things. And I see it with my son, who's 30 years old. When I bought my house, I looked for certain things, but I certainly wasn't thinking about, well, is this recycled wood, or, am I using woods and materials that are friendly to the environment? I didn't think about that. I started thinking about it when ICC built its space in Washington, D.C. We're in the Realtors building on the 6th floor, and I had the privilege of overseeing that construction. And I learned so much, using paints that are safe for the environment, and locally harvested woods, and recycled carpet materials and things like that. So we're learning a lot of these things. I think that's having an impact in the building codes. I think the building codes will be more forward-thinking when it comes to natural disasters and sea rising and things like that, where in the past we've said, we learn from lessons learned, right? We develop the codes based on what's happened in the past. But I think now we're also being more visionary and trying to advance and think, okay, how can it be better moving forward? But this is where all the science comes in, This is why we need the government, the federal agencies, and the academia and other folks that do research to bring that technology and information to us. So I think we're going to see a continuance of care for the environment, more creativity. And I know electric vehicles are a big deal, the charging stations, all these issues that were presented to the Energy Conservation Code and that are already in place in some building regulations, like in California. I think you're going to start seeing a lot of this stuff. You can't prevent progress, Karen. I think, willingly or not willingly, kicking and screaming, we are going to get to, the codes are not the same little pocketbooks that people had in their shirt pocket decades ago. Somebody told me that once. Said, well, the codes are so complicated now, you got volumes and hundreds of pages. It's like, yeah. It's, I heard the story in Chicago when the mayor did the formal adoption of the update to the IBC. There was a presentation that said when Chicago first developed its building code, it was 11 pages long. And the Chicago Tribune said it was way too long. So
excellent. And I think that is a great way to end it for sure. A lot of exciting things in the future and coming ahead, and everyone clearly, based on the participation today, this is an important topic, an interesting topic. A lot of individuals looking to get involved. So our thanks to you, Sarah, for giving this very helpful presentation on codes and standards and the differences and how they're developed. I've learned a lot, and I very much appreciate your being here today. And thank you again to our attendees for joining us, as well as our sponsors for supporting our work here. We will be posting this later to the Women in Standards YouTube channel, and we do have some exciting events coming up in the next couple of weeks and months, so please visit to take a look. I will email everyone when the recording is posted, and my thanks again to you, Sarah, and everyone for joining us.
Well, thank you, Karen, again, for allowing me to be part of this program. And I invite every organization attending this webinar to get involved in the development of codes and standards. Your participation is important, and it's through the volunteers participating that we develop the best model codes and standards in the world. So thank you.
All right, thanks everyone. Have a great rest of your night.